Good evening, everyone. And in a slightly differently than planned, tonight, I'm going to actually be talking about the end of prophecy. And this is because just this week I gave a talk on it at the University of Haifa, and it's fresh in my mind. And I said I should just give it now to you guys while I still have it fresh in my mind. It is presenting a certain point of view. It's not just doing kind of a review. It is presenting kind of the evidence and then what I think happened. So let's jump right into it. So I sent you by email, I sent you source sheets, but I know that you guys like it when I share my screen. So that is what I will do. Let's get this to a normal size though. Okay. All right. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if it's clear. Do I need to make it bigger? Because I can make it bigger. Let's go a little bigger. There we go. Bigger, good. Okay.
Bigger and better.
Bigger and better. Okay, so First Maccabees. All right, First Maccabees is a book that was, finally composed at the end of, let's say, the early Hasmonean period, and it is clearly so. What is? Well, let me introduce this first. So the question is, there's a question of did prophecy end? When did prophecy end? Why did prophecy end? Now, of course, according to tradition, prophecy ends with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, right? So prophecy ends. They're the last prophets. They are giving over their prophecy during the return to Zion, Shivat Zion. And once they're gone, there's no more prophecy. That is according to tradition. I should have actually brought the rabbinic source here, but I'm sorry I forgot to bring it. But it's a very common, it's a well-known source, and so it ends then. And now I want to make a clarification here. This even happened even in a discussion with one of the professors at Haifa, which surprised me, where she kind of slipped into this. There's a difference between saying, when did prophecy end and when did everyone agree there was no more prophecy and stop accepting prophets? And when did Chazal later decide what books made it in? Okay, when is this distinction important? When we talk about Yoel, we're going to talk about Yoel a little bit later. Okay, okay, all the books that we have in our Tanakh, right, in our Hebrew Bible that was compiled by Judeans, right? So all those books date themselves to within these parameters. In other words, they all date themselves to up through Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. Okay, they do not date themselves later than that. Academics can come along later and say, oh, hey, Shir Shirim is later, or your Song of Songs is later, or Kohelet is later. They can start Daniel is Hasmonean. Okay, but the fact is that these books date themselves to well within the period when traditionally prophecy is still going on. That's a different question, though, than what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is how long were there prophets walking around that people were taking seriously, right? And what did that look like? Okay, so that's a little bit different than what we just said. It's not a question of what books made it in. The question is what was going on. Okay, so here we see that on the one hand, we have books like First Maccabees again, and it happened after the death of Judas, right? Judah the Maccabee. The lawless came forth in all the regions of Israel, and all those who worked in justice arose. In those days, there was a very great famine, and the country deserted with them. And Bacchides selected the impious men, established them as masters of the country. He's talking about what a terrible situation it was. And there was a great affliction in Israel, such as not been since the day that a prophet was not seen among them. In other words, we haven't had a prophet for a long time. It was such a terrible time. It went back to the times of the prophets. Okay, so that seems to be an assumption. There are no more prophets. In fact, in First Maccabees in particular, there's kind of this emphasis that there is no more prophecy. I shouldn't say emphasis. The attitude is there's no more prophecy. Second Baruch, or the Apocalypse of Baruch, was written right after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay, and these dates here are important. So it's relatively late. And it explains, furthermore, know then that in former times and in generations of old, our fathers had righteous helpers and prophets and holy men. But we were in our land, and they helped us when we sinned, and they interceded on our behalf with him who made us, because they trusted in their works. And the mighty one heard them and forgave us. But now the righteous have been gathered, in other words, they're dead, and they've been gathered, in the Safra, where they're dead. And the prophets have fallen asleep or disappeared. We too have left our land, and Zion has been taken from us, and we have nothing now except for the mighty one and his Torah. And that actually brings us to one of the explanations that's been proposed for why prophecy ends. Because so here, there are no more prophets. There are no more prophets. When did prophecy exactly end? When we were in our land, there was prophecy. Now there is no more prophecy. Realize that Second Baruch is being written after the Second Temple period, as if it's being after the destruction of the Second Temple, rather, as if it's being written, of course, after the destruction of the First Temple, right? Like Fourth Ezra. So here, when we were in our land, we had prophets. Now we have no more prophets. Says Baruch in this setup. Says Baruch, who is now looking back on the First Temple period, according to an author who's looking back on the Second Temple period. So does he think that prophecy ended with the destruction of the First Temple, or does he believe that it ended with the destruction of the Second Temple when they were in their land? Right? It's not 100% clear. Josephus, of course, writing after the destruction, is quite clear on what are prophecy and what isn't. We do not possess, and here we're going to bring other examples from Josephus later. Oh, just a reminder, please, everyone, mute yourselves. I'm hearing some kind of background noise from somewhere. I'm not sure where. And if everyone mutes themselves, then I know it's my fault. So that also helps. Josephus against Appian. We do not possess myriads of inconsistent books, like as opposed to like the Greeks, like have all these books, We do not possess myriads of inconsistent books conflicting with each other. Our books, those which are justly accredited, are but 2 and 20 and contain, he's combining some of the books, are but 2 and 20 and contain the record of all time. Of these, 5 are the books of Moses, comprising the laws and the traditional history from the birth of man down to the death of the lawgiver, Moses. This period falls only a little short of 3,000 years. From the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, who succeeded Xerxes as king of Persia, the prophets subsequent to Moses wrote the history of the events of their own times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. From Artaxerxes to our time, the complete history has been written, but has not been deemed worthy of equal credit with the earlier records because of the failure of the exact succession of the prophets. In other words, from Artaxerxes on, forget it. We've written books, but they don't really count, says Josephus, because we don't have decent prophets. Now, what does that mean? Which Artaxerxes? Right? So that is actually kind of significant. The Artaxerxes who succeeds Xerxes is Artaxerxes the second, not the first. Whether Josephus knew that Artaxerxes the first was not after Xerxes is a different question. Okay, so it's very possible that he's referring to the first Artaxerxes. That would be, and also if he's familiar with the Ezra and Nehemiah, both of them serve under Artaxerxes. Would he have known which Artaxerxes? I don't think so. In other words, this is a kind of a Shivat Zion sort of thing. The return to Zion, through the return to Zion, we have reliable prophetic books. After that, forget it. Okay, and this is also kind of mirroring the idea that for books to be legitimate, they have to have been written during this time period. Okay, and there's also at this time, and we see this, a belief that prophecy will return in the end times. So here we have in First Maccabees, then Yehuda. This is actually when they're fighting in one area of Jerusalem, and in the other area they're purifying the Beit Mikdash. As I've noted to you before, the Hanukkah is not the end of the battle by any means. There's fighting going on during Hanukkah. There's fighting going on after Hanukkah for years and years. However, this is what's being described here. In one area, they're fighting. In the other area, they're purifying the Beit Mikdash, the temple. So then Yehuda Maccabee, ordered men to fight those in the citadel until he could purify the holy places. And he selected uncorrupted priests, devotees of the law, and they purified the holy places and took the stones of pollution to an unclean place. And they took counsel concerning the altar of whole burnt offering, which had been defiled, as to what they should do with it. So what do they do here? On the one hand, it was actually a legitimate altar to God, and yet it has been defiled. What do you do with it? Right? There's the passage in Shemot where it says you should smash the altars of the idol worshippers, and it says, and you should not do so to Hashem Elokechem, to the Lord your God. And there's at least some clearly who are interpreting it as, if you have an altar that you use for God, you can't smash it. So what do you do, right? And there fell to them a good counsel to tear it down so that it would not become a reproach to them, because the nations defiled it. And they tore down the altar and put away the stones on the mount of the house, Har Habayit, right, in a suitable place, until a prophet would come to give an answer concerning these things. In other words, we're putting this until the Messianic end times, when there's going to be a prophet, and then the prophet will tell us what to do, right? So this is an important aspect. I always like to remind people that this whole thing of putting away the stones and kind of, it seems like burying them or putting them away. We see them much earlier in the Arad temple, which is a first temple structure, and it is clearly modeled on the temple in terms of its structure, and it is retired. It is buried, either with reforms of either Chizkiyahu or Yoshiyahu, probably Yoshiyahu, and the incense altars were put on their side and buried, right? They weren't smashed, they weren't taken away, they weren't used for anything else. They were put on their side with the ashes still in like the little bowl, put on their side and buried. They found them very carefully buried, because, of course, while the temple in Arad was being retired because it was a temple outside of Jerusalem, and with the reform was not allowed, you still do not smash an altar that was used for God. That's just an aside. I love talking about the temple in Arad. Okay. But coming back to this, so they're expecting a prophet to tell them what to do. Okay, that prophet's going to come in the end times. They don't have a prophet now, but eventually they will. In chapter 14, we have this passage, Jews and their priests. This is about Shimon. Shimon of the Hasmonean. Shimon, he takes over the high priesthood. There is very clearly a group that has real problems with this, because he has not been appointed by God in any way. He is not descended of anyone who has been appointed by God. He is not descended, namely, from Tzadok, right? Because that is in general considered the high priest, the line of the high priesthood. Now we know from Second Maccabees that there's been all sorts of messing around with the high priesthood, and people have been buying it left and right. But the idea of the Hasmonean rebellion is that this should not be anymore. In other words, that you should have a legitimate high priesthood, a legitimate, kind of religious leadership. And yet here are these bunch of, country hick priests coming from Modi'in, and they're taking over, and they're taking the high priesthood. They're not descended from Tzadok, and they're not part of the main Jerusalem priesthood. And so they are saying, look, the Jews and their priests have resolved that Shimon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise. And the academic, I don't know consensus, because I'm not, but it seems that the academic consensus is that this actually was very carefully worded as a compromise with the groups who wanted someone from Tzadok, or with the groups who wanted someone that they could clearly say God has chosen this person. They said, okay, let's all agree it's Shimon until there's a trustworthy prophet, right, in the ostensibly in the end times. So this all seems to be pointing to an end of prophecy in the later Second Temple period. Okay, how true is that? How true is that? This is the question. Let's look at some biblical sources to try and figure out how true it is that there aren't any more prophets walking around after after the return to Zion or towards the end of the return to Zion. I see that there is a question or a comment. Let me take a look. Moshe says, doesn't Josephus refer elsewhere to much later prophets? Yes, we're getting to that, Moshe. We're getting to that. Don't worry. We're going to talk about Josephus and what he says and who he says is a prophet and why. Shal, can you define prophet? Shimon should be their leader until a trustworthy prophet. Yes. So Shimon is not their prophetic leader. Well, the idea is Shimon's a leader until a prophet can say either Shimon has the gushbanka, Shimon is assigned by God. It's not that Shimon himself is a prophet. It's that he's the leader until a prophet comes and says either yes, it's him, or no, it should be someone else. That's the idea. However, point well taken. Let's talk about how are we defining prophecy? And this is going to be important also to your point, Moshe, in terms of Josephus, because Josephus does talk about prophetic activity, and we're going to get to that. So despite the fact that Josephus in Against Appian talks about how there's no reliable prophets, and that's an important point. There's no reliable prophets. You can read it if we go back. Yeah.
Can I just butt in for a second? I believe Josephus, in his more arrogant and self-important, self-absorbed moments, and there are a lot of those, seems to imply that he himself has a gift of prophecy.
Okay, so he implies several people have a gift of prophecy, and yet he doesn't call them prophets. Since you're asking, let's jump ahead a bit. So, because I don't want to, let's jump ahead to some prophecy that Josephus talks about. Okay, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit on the source sheet. Let's talk about these before we go back to the biblical text, because I don't want to kind of just leave you with half the story. Now, when we talk about the definition of prophecy, let's be a little bit clearer. So let's define prophecy as the transmission of allegedly divine messages by a human intermediary to a third party. In other words, it's not someone who has a dream and doesn't tell anyone. It's not someone who's like reading omens and says, I can see by these omens, right? It's someone who says, I got a message from God and now I'm telling other people or another person, right? That is for our intents and purposes prophecy, because we'll see that there's a lot of prophetic activity going on that yet it's different from prophecy, and we can feel the difference from prophecy. So that definition is important as we continue. Okay, excuse me just a second. Okay, so Josephus in the Jewish Wars, he's talking about things leading up to this kind of rebellion. So here we see some examples of prophecy. He says, but a further portent was even more alarming. 4 years before the war, when the city was enjoying profound peace and prosperity, there came to the feast at which it is the custom of all Jews to I think that there's a mistake here, to erect tabernacles to God, namely Sukkot. It's during Sukkot, right? One, Jesus, not the Jesus. His name is Jesus, which is Yeshua, which is a short version of Yehoshua. Before Christianity, anyone who was named Yehoshua went by Yeshua. That's what they did. You drop the ho, you always go by Yeshua. Once you have Christianity, you can't do that anymore, and you have Yehoshua, right? So this guy is Yeshua, son of Ananias, a rude peasant, who, he doesn't mean rude, crude is really the word, a crude peasant, a low-level guy, who standing in the temple suddenly began to cry out, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds or four directions, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride. It's not a voice against, it's like, hoy, oh, whoa, against Jerusalem, like, hoy, it's like that, right? A voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people. Day and night, he went about all the alleys with this cry on his lips. And essentially, he gets arrested and harassed and et cetera, because they don't want to hear this. They don't want to hear that by the Romans as well, right? But what Josephus is saying here is that this guy was essentially foreseeing the destruction, right? The war and the destruction. So this is absolutely, this fits with our definition of prophecy, right? Someone getting a message, he seems to be getting a message from God. He's giving it to a third party. And yet, he doesn't say, God has told me this. And he's not called the prophet. He isn't called a prophet. And this is going to be very important to my point a little bit later on. He's never called a prophet by Josephus. And in fact, he's not a prophet. It's very clear that he's just a regular guy. That's what Josephus is making very clear here. He's just some guy who came in from the country, right? That's why it's Sukkot, because Sukkot is, of course, when people come in to the Beit HaMikdash. Why is he in Jerusalem? He's some country guy, right? And all of a sudden he comes to Jerusalem and he's getting some form of Jerusalem syndrome. We all know what Jerusalem syndrome is, right? So he's getting some form of Jerusalem syndrome, and suddenly he starts spewing prophecy, and it's bad prophecy. Like it's ominous prophecy. And yet, but Josephus seems to think that this is reliable. Like he's like, oh, this is what was happening, and it was pretty alarming.
Can I just butt in one more second?
Yes. Sure.
Sorry. One of the most famous stories of Josephus is the story of his surrender to Vespasian, which the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai is apparently a takeoff on, where he approaches Vespasian and says to him, "Hail Caesar!" And he says, and Vespasian says, "I'm no Caesar." But Josephus, Yosef ben Matityahu says to him, "Yes, but one day you shall become Caesar." And that, again.
Well, that's Josephus being pretty self-important, but he doesn't use. This is the thing with Josephus, and this is I'm bringing the next example also. He talks about people doing things here. Let me just go ahead and read it. Here he's talking about the Essenes. Okay, the Essenes. So he says, there's some among them who profess to foretell the future, being versed from their early years in holy books, various forms of purification, and apophthegms of the prophets, and like interpretation of the prophets. And seldom, if ever, do they err in their predictions. And their predictions are not, this is a problem sometimes when you're reading Hebrew translations, by the way. In the common Hebrew translation of Josephus, at least one that I was reading, this is translated as nivuot, and it's not nivuot. He doesn't use the word prophecy. Here's the Greek, entice progoreosisin, right? In other words, in his prognostications, essentially, like their predictions, their prognostications, it's not their prophecies. And he does know how to say prophecy. When he talks about false prophets, he calls them prophets, but he doesn't call reliable people prophets. He thinks these guys are pretty reliable, but what they do isn't prophecy, right? What they do is predictions. And the fact is, honestly, like I don't think that the Dead Sea sect equals the Essenes, but what the Dead Sea sect does is, in fact, they do kind of read into the prophetic books and come up with prophecies. That's one of the things they do. So like they come up with rather predictions based on the prophetic books, right? So you could kind of say, but that's not a prophecy. When we talk about someone getting direct inspiration from God and speaking words to masses, this is what I heard from God, that's not interpreting prophetic book. Now, I do want to say, so let me go back to what some arguments have been for why does prophecy end? Because we'll see that after the destruction, it really is pretty clear the prophecy's over, right? So the question is, why does it end? What's with, not, and again, not inspired activity, but what people call prophecy. And why is it over? Why is it done? So there are a couple of major theories. One, of course, there are tons of theories. One major theory is that there's no more king. We've talked in previous classes about how there were sometimes court prophets, or prophets who weren't necessarily at court, but they would come and give their prophecy to the king. So there's no king to support the prophets. There's no king to kind of prop up the prophets. So no more prophets. Now, honestly, we're going to see this in Nehemiah. You don't need a king to have a prophet. We don't even need Nehemiah. If you just look at Mari, for example, we had, if you remember, we read a letter in Mari that this guy writes to his king, and he is a local official. And the prophet came to this local official and says to him, build the city gate. And he's like, look, I'm busy. I'm with the harvest. I don't have time to build the city gate. And the prophet's like, build the city gate or there will be piles of corpses. So this city official writes to the king and says, listen, I'm reporting what this prophet told me. I don't have extra workers to build the city gate. Tell me what you want to do, right? But the prophet didn't come with a message for the king. The prophet came with a message for the local leader, right? He came with a message saying, build the city gate or people will die. Okay, so it's you don't need a king. All you need is someone for the prophet to talk to, and there's always someone for the prophet to talk to. Like that's not that big a deal. Another argument is once you have written books, you don't need prophets. or they take the place of prophets. You've got these written books to interpret, and interpretation takes the place of prophecy. Now there is something to that, and again we'll see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But yet, okay, and in fact, and this is again, we're going to go back to the book, to the text itself, the biblical text itself, and see, does that hold up, right? So for example, if we go back to what is in Second Baruch, we too have left our land, and Sion has been taken from us, and we have nothing now except for the mighty one and his Torah. So what do we have instead of the prophets and the righteous people? We have God and the Torah, right? So there is an idea that once you have the books and all the, like, everyone agrees on the books, you can kind of look to the books and you interpret the books rather than coming up with new prophecy. And yet we'll see that these coexisted. So it's not quite that clear. And I'll bring proof, okay, when we get into, we're going to jump into the biblical text and we'll take a look at that. We're not, I'll have more Josephus for you later, but the thing with Josephus is when he talks about prophecy, and even when he speaks about a specific Essene who he kind of credits with predictive activity, let's say, that he predicts the future, he uses the word mantis. He doesn't use the word prophecy with him. And we're going to see little later on that when he talks about false prophets, yeah, he does use the word prophecy. So it's not that big a it's not like he can't say the word prophet. It's not that he doesn't know the word, doesn't use the word ever. But when he's talking about reliable predictions, he doesn't use the word prophet. He doesn't call them prophets, and he doesn't call it prophecy in general. Now, so let's go to some biblical sources. Okay, here we go. All the biblical sources are lined up. Okay, let us start with Zechariah. This is the classic example of a prophet predicting the end of prophecy, right? And it's a classic example, especially because it's Zechariah, right? So he's one of the last prophets. Now, in academic circles, this part of Zechariah is called Pseudo-Zechariah and dated very late. Certainly in Second Temple period, but dated relatively late. So this has even more significance if you take the academic dating, because this is pretty late. But regardless, you're talking about one of the last prophets. And supposedly Zechariah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are it. Like, that's it, right? That's the end, and those are the last prophets. So let's see what he says. Let's jump to where he talks about, okay. Okay. Ne'um Hashem Tzvaot. Achrit et shmot hatabim min haaretz v'lo yizachru od. So on that day, the Lord of hosts says, I will cut off the names of kind of the idols from the land. V'lo yizachru od. They will no longer be remembered or known or recognized. V'gam et hanevi'im v'et ruach hatum'ah avir min haaretz. And also the prophets and the spirit of impurity, I will make pass from the land. Now, so it sounds as if these prophets are prophets of idol worship, right? It sounds like these prophets are prophets to foreign gods, like if we're just reading it in order. But we'll see that that's not so. V'hayaki yinavei ish od, v'amru elav aviv v'imo yodav lo tichye. V'yodav lo tichye. And it will be when someone will prophesy, his parents, his father and mother will say to him, those who gave birth to him, they'll say, you shall not live. Ki sheker dibarta b'shem Hashem, because you spoke falsely in the name of the Lord. Utkaruhu avihu v'imo yodav b'hinavo. And his father and his mother who gave birth to him will stab him when he prophesies. This is supposed to shock us. We're supposed to be shocking. This is a shocking scenario. It's supposed to shock us. That's why he keeps on emphasizing these are the people who gave birth to him. And yet they're going to say, now, why are they killing him? They're killing him because his prophecy must be false. I see your hand, Hido. Give me just a moment. They see that the prophecy is, they assume the prophecy must be false because he's prophesying in the name of God. So he's not prophesying in the name of an idol. He's prophesying in the name of the Lord of Israel, right? That's who he's prophesying in the name of. And when he does so, they know, well, you must be a false prophet. Your punishment is death. Vaya bayom hahu yevoshu hanaviim ish micheziono b'hinavoto. On that day, the prophets will be ashamed when they prophesy of their visions. V'lo yilbeshu aderet se'ar leman kachesh. And they won't wear the traditional hair shirt of a prophet so that they can deny being a prophet. What's interesting is, but they're prophesying. They're getting prophecies and they're just ashamed of it. So they're not showing they're the prophets. They're not saying the prophecy. They're still getting them though, right? Va'amar lo navi anochi, ish oved adama anochi, ki adam hiknani menurai. And he said, I am not a prophet. I am a worker of the land, a worker in agriculture, because I've been essentially in indentured servitude, right, since my birth, since my youth, right. I'm not a prophet, right. What are the strikes between your arms here on your back? In other words, he's been whipping himself in an ecstasy for prophecy, right? And he says, Asher who keti beg ma'avai, it's less shameful for him to say, I was beaten up either by my friends or my lovers. I was beaten up, right, by, let's say, my friends. That's less shameful than saying I'm a prophet, right? He'd rather say that than say I'm a prophet. Okay, is Ido still with us? Ido, you had a question?
No, it's a new phone. I pressed it by mistake.
Okay. All right. So if we go back to what's going on here, what can we learn from this passage? We can learn a bunch of things. What's interesting is that these guys are still apparently getting prophecy. They're getting prophecy. They're just so ashamed of it they can't tell anyone. Everyone's so sure that it's false, and everyone looks down on prophets so much that they are not going to say the prophecy because everyone's like, you are lying and you should die. And they're so ashamed, they would rather come up with anything else. And yet, the way Zechariah is talking, it sounds like right now there are lots of prophets. That's what it sounds like. He's saying, in the end time, these prophets are going to be ashamed of themselves. Right now, apparently, they're all running around and talking, right? That's what it seems like. Now let's look, and I want to point this out. What Zechariah is doing here, when he says, "Ve'amar lo navi anochi," he says, "I am no prophet. Ish oved adama anochi," I am a man who's working the soil. Who is he echoing? Who can remember who says something almost identical that he's clearly playing with? Amos. Amos says, right, he is. Let's look at this here. I'm reading here. Amatzia, who's a Kohen, a priest in Beit El, he says to Amos, he says, buddy, go to the land of Yehudah. They'll eat bread there and prophesy there. Right? So eat bread there and prophesy there. Why? Because Amatzia is assuming that Amos is the sort of prophet that supports himself from his prophecy. Says, they'll like what you say in Yehuda. Go there, and they'll give you bread. Stop prophesying around here. I don't want you around. Don't keep prophesying in Bethel, because this is a king's temple, and it's the royal house, and you keep on saying this stuff, you're going to be, he's implying that if you keep on doing this, you're going to be held on pain of treason, right? Vayan Amos vayomer el Amatzia lo navi anochi velo ven navi anochi ki voker anochi uvoles shikmi. Okay, and so Amos says to Amatzia, he says, I am not a prophet, and I am not the son of a prophet. Namely, again, I'm not the member of the prophetic guild. I don't make my money from being a prophet, because I am a herdsman and I take care of sycamore trees. God took me from behind the sheep. And God said, go and prophesy to my nation Israel. So on the contrary, I'm the real deal. I'm the real deal. I was nobody, and God took me and said, prophesy. And Zechariah is playing with this. Amos says, I am not a prophet because I'm a herdsman. And Zechariah says, I'm not a prophet, I'm an agricultural worker. And he's flipping it on its head. When Amos said that, he was saying, I am a true prophet. And this guy is denying that he's a prophet by saying, I work the land. Now, one of the reasons why it's cute that first of all, it's cute that Zechariah is doing this and he's flipping that quote from Amos, but it's also very clear that Zechariah's got the book, right? Zechariah has the book of Amos's prophecies. It's very clear this kind of play with Amos's words shows that he's got the scroll, right? So here you have a situation where you have scrolls of prophetic works, and yet you have active prophecy. So just because you've got the Torah and you've got books of prophecy doesn't mean there's no more prophecy. And again, Zechariah seems to here be speaking in, or if you think this is Deutero-Zechariah, right, the author of this passage, is speaking at a time when there's lots of prophecy, apparently. Because he's saying in the future, I'm looking forward to the time when these prophets are going to shut their mouths because they're going to be ashamed. They're going to be ashamed. They'll think they're getting a prophecy, but they'll be ashamed of it. So Moshe Matitya has a comment. Okay, I have a few comments here. So from Danny and Libby, is Zechariah implying that he himself is a self-hating prophet? No, I think Zechariah is implying that he's a true prophet. He's a true prophet. And in the future, these false prophets will justly be ashamed of themselves. And Moshe Matitya said, Zechariah seems to be saying only a true prophet will deny his own prophetness. I don't think so. I think that that he's playing with Amos's words. I don't think that he's saying a true prophet, because he's saying this. He says this because let's go back to Pasuk Bet. Let's go back to verse 2, where Zechariah says, I'm going to get rid of the prophets and the spirit of impurity. Now we see this in Yechezkel also, this idea that sometimes God gives false prophecy to people, which is a way of explaining why a prophecy doesn't come true if you think you're a true prophet. But maybe this connects to that. In other words, just because these prophets think they're saying the truth doesn't mean they're saying the truth, especially when you talk a spirit of impurity, because that's sometimes what it's called when there's this, or not, you call it a false spirit usually. When a prophet gets a spirit that misleads him into thinking that it's saying a false prophecy, and if the prophet himself isn't a bad guy and a charlatan. So there's this idea that these prophets are in some way false, and it's a good thing for them to shut up, right? They should no longer be speaking, right? And that's going to end, in fact. Daniel, let me say, are Zechariah and Amos deriving from the same mother source? I don't think so. It's a little bit too close, and Amos and Zechariah are very far apart. Unless it's like this saying that everyone is saying, I don't think so. You could argue it. You could argue that, this is a saying, like Hagam Sha'ul Nevi'im, is Sha'ul also among the Nevi'im, which is apparently a saying. So you say, there's a saying, I'm not a prophet. Yeah, they're both playing with it. I don't think so. I think when Amos says it, it has the force of an original statement. And when Zechariah is saying it, he's joking. It's a joking situation. And I think Zechariah is playing with Amos. Another possibility of what he's playing with from Amos, if we take a look at Amos chapter 8, when he says that Amos actually is looking forward to a time when everyone's going to prophesy. Right? Or not, actually, no, that's Yoel. He's not looking forward to a time. He's looking forward to a time when people want prophecy and they can't get it. Right? So if I'm reading from verse 11 from Yud Aleph, Hinei yamim ba'im, nu'um Adonai Elohim v'shlachti ra'av ba'aretz. Behold, days are coming, says the Lord God, and I will send a hunger in the land. And we could all sing L'Rav L'Lechem. It's all a nice tune, right? It would be a nice tune if I could sing. But L'Rav L'Lechem V'Lotzama L'Mayim Ki Im L'Shmoa Et Divrei Hashem. They're not hungry for bread. They're not thirsty for water. They just want to hear the words of God, and they won't be able to find it. They're going to go from sea to sea. They're going to go from north to east. They're going to wander around to ask for the word of God, to seek out the word of God, and they will not find it. On that day, the beautiful young women will faint, and the men, and so will the young men, from hunger, right? Why it's a punishment because of those who swear by the Ashmat Shomron, the sin of Shomron, like that, the either the illegitimate worship of God in Shomron or or an idol in Shomron, and they say who swear by the God of Dan, and may live the path to Beersheba, and they're going to, because they're not being faithful to God now in the way they speak and what they swear by, they are going, when they will suddenly get a hunger and a thirst for the word of God, they will be looking for it, they won't be able to find it. I wonder if Zechariah is also playing with that idea, that you're not going to get any prophecy in the future. There won't be anything. And Zechariah is flipping that to be a positive thing, whereas Amos is describing it as a tremendously negative thing. So what we see in Zechariah is there seems to be a lot of prophecy going around at the time, and he's looking forward to a time when there won't be prophecy. Why? Because any prophecy in the Lord's name will be acknowledged as false. His parents will say, "You are lying. You are lying." And people will still be prophesying. It's interesting that Zechariah here is not even, Zechariah here is not even, it's like you can't even imagine a time where people will just stop prophesying at all. What you can imagine is a time where people are prophesying but not telling anyone. They're still like beating their backs to get prophecy, but they're not going to say anything because they're ashamed of it. And everyone's automatically going to think that they're lying. So we're going to come back to that later about the idea that if they're doing it, then they must be lying. Oh, I didn't realize how much time I'm taking, but there's a lot. I'll try and hurry up a little. Okay. Now, Yoel, it's interesting that Yoel is an interesting book. Okay. Why is Yoel an interesting book? Because if you read Yoel, he's speaking at a time where you have a standing Beit HaMikdash. He's looking back to a destruction. Okay, he's remembering a destruction, and and in Jerusalem, and so it seems like it's after the destruction of the first temple. It seems to be during a second temple time when the second temple is standing. It's not that late because he talks about the Greeks as being like a people far away, like they're not really interacting with Greeks. So it's Yoel himself doesn't have a date, right? So that Yoel, the book, doesn't give us a date. You would have to, if you were just going to go by Yoel, you would have to give it a date in. You could put it before Malachi, because Malachi is talking at a time when the temple is functioning. But would absolutely be after Haggai and Zechariah, because Haggai and Zechariah are still building the temple. So if we're saying, okay, he's looking back to a destruction and he's in a temple now, it's got to be the beginning of the second temple period. And it's interesting that he has a different perspective. He talks about it as there isn't prophecy now, and there will be prophecy. He says, "Vayachrechen," and it will come to pass afterwards, of course, as again in the latter days, in the Messianic age. Eshpochet ruchi al kol basar, v'nib'u bnechem uvnotechem, ziknechem chalomot yechalomun, bachorechem chazionot yiru. And that in that time, I'm going to pour my spirit over all flesh, and they will prophesy. Your sons and your daughters, your older people will dream dreams. Your young people will see visions. V'gam al ha'avadim v'al shvachot b'yamim hahem eshpochet ruchi. And on the slaves and maidservants in those days, I will pour my spirit. So everyone is going to have prophecy, and then of course there will also be supernatural signs. He's looking forward to a time when there will be prophecy. Yoel seems to be talking during a time, or at least from his perspective, where there isn't real prophecy now. Now, Yoel itself is a book of prophecy, and that's another thing that I want to say, that yes, from the point of view of Chazal, Yoel has to be up through Shivat Zion. The book of Yoel seems to be talking when the Beit HaMikdash is standing and firm. The second Beit HaMikdash is standing and firm. You could still say, well, he's before Malachi, right? Because Malachi we don't have a date for either. But at the same time, it seems like, and here we have a book of prophecy. It's a book of prophecy that you see that's accepted as a book of prophecy that's put in. You have a book prophet prophesying at that time. Okay. I'm going to skip over this thing in Yeshayahu because we're running very, very short on time. So let's go to Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is really kind of a key text for me in the argument that I'm going to make, which is that there's that what really does it for prophecy is not the fact that there are written books, And it's not the fact that there's no king. It's the fact that there's been a shift during the exile, perhaps specifically during the Persian exile, when they were under Persia, and no longer are prophecies taken seriously as from the get-go. I'm going to explain a little bit more in a bit, but I don't want to lose everyone. So here, if we come into Nehemiah, so what happens is, I think for speed, I'll read it in English. Now it came to pass when it was reported to Sanballat and Tobiah and to Geshem the Arabian and the Arab and unto the rest of our enemies that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left there. Remember that Nehemiah's big thing is building the wall around the city, and that's what people find very threatening. Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, come, let us meet together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono, but they thought to do me mischief. In other words, Nehemiah doesn't trust them. They want to meet him. He's like, yeah, I know what happens when I meet you. Forget it, okay? And I said to them, no, I'm busy. I'm in the middle of a big project. You may have heard of it. I can't come, right? And so they send 4 times, and then they send Sanballat with an open letter in his hand, where it says, he says, it's reported among the nations, and Geshem says it, that you and the Jews are going to rebel. And that's why you're building the wall. And you want to be their king. You are becoming a king for them. This is the sort of things that he said. And you also set up prophets to call about you in Yerushalayim, a king in Yehuda. And now we're going to report this to the king. Like these things. So now you better come and meet us. And he's like, no, he's like, no, this didn't happen. You're completely making this up. Right? And he's like, because everyone's trying to make us afraid so that we don't do it. And he says, so he's like, you say that I set up prophets. I'll tell you, it's a total lie. It's a total lie. Now, is it a total lie because there are no prophets? Is it a total lie because there are no prophets saying he's king? There's also, we'll talk about it a little bit. Nehemiah doesn't seem to care about prophets at all. If we look at Yirmiyahu, of course, is the end of the first temple period. So Yirmiyahu is always talking about the prophets as a power group. He addresses the prophets and the Kohanim, the priests, and the nation, right? And the king, right? And he addresses them. They're a real power group in Jerusalem. Nehemiah never talks like that, ever. He only seems to really pay attention to prophets here when his enemies are citing them. He doesn't seem to care about them. And now let's look and see what happens. He comes to the house of Shmaya, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetav'el. He's shut up in his house. Now, this guy we're given the name of his father and his grandfather. That means he's important. Okay, this guy's shut up in his house. And Nehemiah is visiting him, which means remember, Nehemiah is the governor of the area. And Nehemiah is visiting this guy who shut him in his house. So it seems like either they're friends or he's visiting out of respect. And what does this guy Shemaiah say to him? Vayomer niva'ed el beit Elohim el toch ha'echal nisgrad el tot ha'echal ki ba'im lahargecha v'layla ba'im lahargecha. So he says, let's go together to the house of God, namely to the temple, to the Heichal, in other words, actually within the temple precincts. And let's close the doors because they're coming to kill you. Tonight, they're coming to kill you. So let's go hide together in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, in the Heichal. V'omra ha'ish kamoni yivrach. And I said, will a man like me run away? Umi chamoni asher yavo el ha'Heichal v'chai. And who is like me who will come to the Heichal and live? And it's not clear, does he mean and live or does he mean to live? In other words, is he worried that going into the Beit HaMikdash like that will kill him because he's going into a holy area? Or does he mean a person like me, would I do such a thing in order to live? Right? I'm not a coward. Lo avo, I will not come. Okay. Va'akira v'hine lo Elohim shlacho. And I knew that God didn't send him. Ki hanivu'ah diber alai v'Tovia v'Sanballat schara, because he spoke a prophecy to me, and Tovia and Sanballat hired him. What's going on here? Well, prophecy. It didn't sound like a prophecy at all. He's saying, no, I understood God didn't send him. He spoke a prophecy. No, he was hired by Tovia and Sanballat. Leman Sachorhu, because he was hired. Leman Ira Ken B'chatati, so that I would be scared and I would do so and I would sin. Vayalehem l'shem ra leman yecharfuni, and they would have a bad thing to say about me, right? And then he turns to God, right? And he says, Zachra Elohai Tovia Sanballat k'ma'asav ele v'gam l'noadia ha'nevi'ah u'liyeter ha'nevi'im asher hayu miyar imoti. He says, God, remember this against Tovia and Sanballat, and also remember it against Noadiah, the prophetess, and the other prophets who are trying to scare me. Okay, these prophets were trying to scare me. Now, this is what I'm about to quote. This is from an article by someone named Shepard. He points to this, that this is actually a way, why is Nehemiah talking about how they're trying to scare him, they're trying to scare him, they're trying to scare him? Part of the reason is very possibly that when we learn about false prophets in Devarim Yudchet, in Deuteronomy 18, what do we see? It says you should, the prophet that speaks a word, who speaks a word in my name that I did not tell him to speak, that I did not command him to speak, he speaks, or who speaks in the name of other gods, he should die. And how will you know? You'll know if he says it in the name of God and the thing doesn't happen. That is the thing that God did not say. He spoke falsely. Lo tagur mimenu, and you should not be scared of him. You should not be scared of the false prophet. And so Nehemiah is saying over and over, I'm not scared of them. I'm not scared of them. I'm not scared of them. Right? So he's saying these guys are false prophets. Okay, so if we go back to, and in fact, what we see here is there's an idea that prophecy is still going on, but these guys are false prophets, right? Prophecy is still, Zechariah is looking in the future. They're going to still prophesy, but they're false. By definition, they're false. And in fact, we see this with Josephus, and I know I've gone a little bit over time. Let's at Qumran. So at Qumran, it's very interesting because Qumran will talk about how. Let's take a look. At Qumran will talk about how their leader is engaged in what we might think of as kind of prophetic activity. In other words, he's saying what's going to come based on books of the prophets and stuff like that. And yet they don't call him a prophet. They don't call him a prophet ever, right? But the guys against them, they call false prophets. Okay, they call them Navi'ei Chazav. They're false prophets. And there they use the word Navi. But for themselves, they don't use the word Navi. They don't use it for themselves. They don't use it for their leaders. Okay, now I know someone was pointing out to me this week that with Yochanan Hyrcanus, there is an idea that Yochanan Hyrcanus is a prophet, and that requires more investigation. But when the group is talking about themselves, and they've got real mixed feelings about Yochanan Hyrcanus. Obviously, everyone does. But they're, in general, they are not prophets, and the bad guys, I should say, the guys who oppose them are false prophets. So here we have what kind of prophetic activity are they doing? This is Pesher Chavakuk. One thing that we have at Qumran is a unique way of interpretation where they would take a book, usually a prophetic book. There's Pesher Chavakuk, there's Pesher Nahum, and they would say there are other Pesharim. Some of them are just collections of verses from different places. And they say this verse, its real meaning is talking about us. It's either talking about us, it's talking about what happened to us 2 years ago, or it's talking about what's going to happen in the future, right? That's the real meaning. And here in Pesher Chavakuk, they explain it. Pesher Devar al habogdim lacharit hayamim hema aritzei abrit asher lo yaminu b'shem am et kol habaot al ador acharon b'pi kohen. Natan el bilibo bina lifshor et kol divrei avadav hanaviim asher biadam sefer el et kol baot al amo ve'edato. So the interpretation of this here, he's interpreting Chavakuk, and it's talking about the traitors in the last days. Now the Qumran group thinks that they're living in the last days. They're talking about their enemies now. They are violators of the covenant who will not believe when they hear all that is going to happen. To the final generation, namely us, from the mouth of the priest is their leader, right? The priest to whom God has given understanding in his heart to interpret all the words of his servants, the prophets, by means of whom God has declared all that is going to happen to his people and congregation. What does this mean? This means that their leader, our leader, knew how to interpret the Habakkuk and Nahum and other prophetic books and understand what's going to happen to us. And our enemies don't believe him. And yet they call him HaKohen, they call him the priest, and they never call him a prophet. Okay. Now let's look though, when they talk about the other guys' leaders, I'm going to skip a little here. The stumbling block of their iniquity they have placed before themselves, and they come to inquire of you, they're talking to God, by means of the mouth of lying prophets who are themselves seduced by error. And they, with mocking lips and an alien tongue, speak to your people, deceitfully ridiculing all their deeds. For they have not chosen the way of your heart. They have not listened to your word. For they say of the vision of knowledge, it is not certain, and of the way of your heart, it is not that. So in other words, our people, we don't do prophecy. We're not going to call it nevuah. We're not going to call our leader a navi. But those guys, we will call them false prophets. Okay. Why? I would argue when we see something similar in Josephus, where he talks about a false prophet, and there he uses the word prophet, right? As opposed to what he usually does, when he's talking about a false prophet, he uses the word prophet, okay? So what's going on? And what I would argue is there's been a major shift in worldview. During Beit Rishon, during the first temple period, any prophet came speaking to anyone, you had to take him seriously. Are they speaking the truth? Are they speaking falsely? We don't know, but we've got to figure it out, because a prophet comes to you and tells you something, you have to take it seriously. Now, this was not unique in Yehuda and Yisrael, even though they took prophecy more seriously, you could say, than, let's say, well, we don't have a lot. What we have are really the Mari letters. Like, we don't have a lot of tremendous evidence. We have the Mari letters. In the Mari letters, we see people reporting, a prophet came to me and said this. I must now report it to the king. In fact, we even have one letter where the person who's reporting it to the king knows what he's reporting, the king's not going to like. And he tells the king, listen, where I used to live, I always reported these things. I have to report it to you, because if it happens and I didn't report it, then it's my fault. So even though you don't like hearing this prophecy, I must report it to you. So you have this idea that someone comes, and we even see it with Amos, actually, in our example here. So if we have, am I in the right place still here? What happens is that Amaziah reports to Yeravam, the king of Israel, what Amos is saying. This is an important report, right? Yeravam must know what this prophet is going around and saying. Okay, prophets must be taken seriously. But once we are in the Second Temple period, there's an assumption. A prophet comes up to me, and the first assumption seems to be the prophet's lying, not with Haggai and Zechariah, who are very well entrenched in the people. It seems like they're particularly well entrenched with the people coming back, and are able to urge them on to build the Beit HaMikdash. But in general, for prophets, the first assumption seems to be, and this is what Zechariah is talking about also. The first assumption is you are a liar. Why is Zechariah looking forward to the time when everyone recognizes they're liars? Because to Zechariah, they're all liars. They are liars. First of all, they're liars. Okay, so there's been a shift from every prophecy must be taken seriously, and then we have to figure out if it's false or true. Remember that Yirmiyahu himself is confronted with a false prophet, and Yirmiyahu says to him, I hope what you say is true, because Yirmiyahu doesn't know. He can't just say, oh, you're a false prophet. He's like, I hope what you say is true, but if what you say is not true, then you're a false prophet, right? And you have to take it seriously. But there's been a shift, a tremendous shift in the worldview, where from now on, a prophet comes, your first assumption is that he's a false prophet. Then you have to see, if he has to prove himself, is he speaking the truth? And that's what we see with Nehemiah. Nehemiah's assumption is, this guy is giving me a prophecy, he is a liar. Right? Now, in fact, perhaps what we see with Nehemiah is actually, because remember, Nehemiah was high up in the Persian court. He comes to Jerusalem and he doesn't pay attention to prophets at all. Apparently, there's a group of them. I mean, Sanballat and Tovia are pointing to prophets. It sounds like there are a bunch of them, right? Nehemiah doesn't care. Nehemiah's not used to listening to prophets. He's not used to paying attention to prophets. He's coming from the Persian court. It sounds like that's not what they do there. And he comes back to Yehuda, where there's still some prophets, going around saying one thing or the other. Apparently they're saying, don't build the wall. And he's like, you guys, I don't have to take you seriously. You're just trying to scare me off. Someone hired you. A guy comes to him and says, he visits someone. And the guy says to him, they're coming to kill you tonight. Let's hide together in the temple. And he's like, you liar. You are just a hireling. Right? And we don't even know how he knows this. We don't know why he comes to this assumption, but his assumption is, I don't like what you're saying, and prophecies, and if you're a prophet, you have to prove to me what you're saying. My assumption is you're lying. And that's what we see that contributes to the total. And then once we get to Qumran, much later in the Second Temple period, and Josephus, after the Second Temple, after the destruction, there's simply, you use the word prophet for someone modern when you're indicating that he's a liar, right? For someone who you believe, who is a contemporary, you're not going to call him a prophet, right? You're going to say he's doing something else, because if you were saying he's a prophet, he's lying, right? So I think that's the key here, is a shift in worldview that happens during the Persian period, and then coming back. I'm not saying that no one stayed, people stayed, right? But certainly the elites coming back, prophets are not taken seriously anymore. And if you're saying a true prophecy, you got to prove it, or you've got to be saying something people really, really like, and so what happens is that prophecy is held in such contempt. You still have prophets kind of coming up here and there, but by the time you get to the end of the Second Temple period, there really is just a universal agreement that prophecy is gone. So that's my argument, right? And that's what I was talking about this week in Haifa, and I wanted to share it with you guys. And thank you for joining me.